Hello everyone, today we continue our series about the history of Medievistics. In the last episode we attentioned 15th, 16th century humanistic, mostly Italian, Renaissance. Today we look more at the 17th, the 18th century as well, focusing also on other important national historiographies such as the French and a German one that, as you know, also paved the way to the 19th century. And so a very peculiar moment for Europe, for Western historiography, for all the various national perspectives that we will sort of more analytically dissect and evaluating the impact of. In the last episode, we essentially stopped to the Counter-Reformation, religious disputes, Christian confessions, and rivalries even among Catholic factions. That provided, however, a powerful impetus, particularly in France during the 17th and the 18th centuries, for the development of a systematic archival investigation, increased reliance on charters and private records, and a gradual enhancement of critical approaches to historical studies. This path naturally occurs in parallel with the development of France in the second half of the 17th century under the Sun King as the tendentially hegemonic continental power in Europe, and therefore also the greatest one, surpassing Spain and achieving, in fact, also in the field of historiography, reacquired relevance, not like the French had not been important, but indeed, as we've seen, the gold standard in the previous centuries had been the Italian scholarship. At this point, the French matured a much more sort of stable, concentrated national historiography as far as also the branch of Medievistics is concerned. Naturally, we are in times that, as we will understand throughout the series, are not yet considered as fully sort of, acceptable in standards compared to our own, especially second half of the 19th century, 20th century academic one. Nevertheless, these historiographical works are incredibly important, not just because of the influence that they emanated in setting a specific worldview and cultural legacy in the same historiography and scholarship, but were the very foundation on which, in fact, the later historiography could, in fact, grow further. We've seen it fairly well in the previous topic. We understand here a very important passage that is typical, in fact, of the later and eventually contemporary era, namely the necessity of drawing from an increasingly systematized, uniformed, and properly criticized set of sources, right? Up to this point, as we've seen, humanistic scholars had fundamentally toured Europe, especially researching cathedral chapters, archives, digging veritable treasures that in fact are the same manuscripts on which we philologically and codicologically rely, right? And in this second modern age and in the sort of contemporary era, we also arrive to a point where some very important historians of these centuries had access to some manuscripts that for some reason later on, such as wars or just simple theft or degradation of any kind, manuscript-wise in particular, were lost, right? And this is extremely fascinating because we literally are reading people who could access that and that started having the originals, and it started having also a close sort of modern take and sort of, in fact, philological, historical standards towards these sources to very intelligently, by the way, criticize, analyze them, studying them, researching further, but not having been able, but not having from our position exactly the same manuscript evidence that they relied on, right? And the method was really based on The normal, again, the scholar was usually an aristocrat or a prelate, a clergyman of sort that organized transversally. There was a lot of, as we'll see now, lay and ecclesiastical interaction. The very enormous archival researches and enterprises that will be at the foundation of properly European historiography. This actually starts, as well as we will probably see today as well, from Italy itself, with the work of Ludovico Antonio Muratori. That is the first guy whose standards are basically still followed today, starting from the late 17th, or actually the first half of the 18th century. Then we will see Weiss. We will start looking at the Monumenta Germania Historica, etc. So all works that we still rely on, with of course, updated editions, etc., but still fundamentally relying on the works of these giants of European historiography, without whom, we wouldn't even properly have most of the sources, especially systematized in an era that literally had not known up to that point such an enormous, in fact, not yet at this point, encyclopedical method in criticism. As a matter of fact, even though some of these authors fit the broader concept of the Enlightenment, they were very often also quite conservative traditional individuals. Muratori himself was a pretty faithful subject of the Holy Roman Empire and dedicated his sources, his editions of manuscript tradition to Charles VI and Maria Theresia, right? So we should never confuse, let's say, the modern myth of the Enlightenment, because there was, of course, some good part of the Enlightenment, but very often you realize it had a few to do with the kind of Enlightenment that is instead normally celebrated, right? If we are told that, like Muratori was a prelate, for example, and you would think, oh my God, this was an obscurant, this was a terrible Christian, they didn't know how to write history, they were all biased. Well, you will never understand essentially the foundation, not just of Western civilization, but of the same contemporary historiography. And unfortunately, many people are unaware of this too, also because they hardly ever research the sources or write articles on this stuff and really picture the scale of these enormous works. And what is fascinating naturally about France is this increase, not just the beginning of this pretty thorough inquiries. Imagine what France was before the French Revolution and the destruction of monasteries, of older archives, nobiliar charters. That was, of course, the loss of this was one of the greatest tragedies and crimes, by the way, against mankind. There is this increasing interest towards charters, right? And that's when essentially diplomatics is born, when also partly some, you can say anthropology was exactly born at this point, but there are some disciplines that you can make the case, like in this one, that fundamentally were founded in some way that starts taking essentially the direction we're more familiar with some important moral and scientific methods at this point. Private records, basically. These guys were moving on from the Renaissance, that was a moment of great classical legacy that was mostly aimed at both recovering and treasuring the raw sources of the past. As we said before, there was literally, diplomats, people who traveled for any case, and that being quite highly literate, they brought home manuscripts. They had these libraries that in and of themselves were veritable treasure in their own regard. The Library of Petrarch, something that the same Boccaccio, for example, was an incredibly cultured person, spoke marvels of. And there's all a history, by the way, of all these funds, of all these libraries. What happened to them? This is something I had the pleasure to study also, for example, as far as the passage from antiquity to the Middle Ages is concerned. Where was this knowledge actually passed down? Was it just about the monasteries? Was there something else? It's a very fascinating answer that, we will, if anything, give in another video, because this is really off topic at this point. But the understanding that fundamentally there are, if you want, even secondary sources that are not always about the shiniest depiction of the past, or just the most telling about the most important people, or having some more relevant importance in the bigger schemes, but that, as far as increased specialization for this or that sake, start really to be needed and appreciated, right? There are many, for example, novelists starting from late, think about Dumas. We are in the 19th century, if anything, but you realize that these were people who had read a lot, right? And they had read a lot, not just fiction, but they had a culture that sort of tried to reconstruct the past through novels themselves. I think that's a very important aspect of literature. When I think about different disciplines, including philosophy, etc., I can't help to always tie them with history, because otherwise, what's the actual point of separating them in a purely abstract sense from reality? I think the most beautiful, I love, of course, history, let's say historical fiction to some degree, or at least historical fiction can be such because it was literally written by people who lived back then, right? So telling about their own times, even as fiction at their own time. Or movies, of course, for the more recent forms of entertainment and more, like Schwerpunkt makes history content. Because at the end of the day, there is a meaning that is being dug from the past, and that admittedly in this step of looking at also lower types of sources gets diluted, but helps to sort of compose a bigger picture, one that is necessary to tie also the most important events together in a more critical fashion that also helps, in fact, visualizing them better. I always do this on Schwerpunkt myself. I can make a video about an incredibly specific topic that most would consider as niche or whatever. And sometimes I really try to explain the bigger picture beyond any, tolerable ambition. And it couldn't happen if, of course, I didn't put all these bricks together. Maybe that there are the foundations that are more important, the skeleton, than the matins or something else. But overall, you can't have the whole building without the wall. And of course, the details as such are always important in any endeavor, and they often mirror, if anything, not much the perfectionism, but the necessity of completion of a broader work. Right. So, the French naturally is a great civilization in this period, really. And on top, of course, their previous historiography, their own Renaissance, if anything, we haven't talked much about that. I made a video, if anything, about the Mos Gallicus in the history of law, that obviously had some kind of broader political and cultural meaning to it rather than a strictly legal one. And it's naturally a very traditional, this is before the revolution, interest as well. In this aforementioned pursuit, the Benedictine monks of the congregation of Saint-Mao, commonly known as the Maurists, in fact, achieved significant recognition for their collaborative scholarly efforts, because they were a team, so to say. They were literally the Benedictine order of the congregation of Saint-Mao, at least, and so a community that had also something to say within the broader landscape of ecclesiastic and ecclesiological importance, because producing a history, as we will see now, is also a hallmark of importance, of relevance, as far as the clergy has to guide, has to provide an example with a narrative, foundation, meaning. They achieved this in particular at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, quite a relevant one, by the way, as we've seen in the videos, in the video about medieval Paris in particular, because as you know, Saint-Germain, Saint-Remy, Saint-Geneviève, these are all the mythical sort of, and not so mythical, properly saintly founders of the spiritual realm of France. And so we're talking here the beating heart of one of the most shockingly impacting cultures in the history of mankind. And among the monks, the Maurists at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, we find Jean Mabillon standing out among them. This was a monk from Reims, by the way, had a random place, of course, tied to the same Remigian tradition, and of course the crowning place, right, in a beautiful cathedral, all of the Saint Kings of France. So we're talking really a higher sense of universal Catholic vision that entered the Maurist order in 1664. These are the years that we cover normally in the series about the prodromes, if anything, to the siege of Vienna, and the first years of real maturity of Louis XIV. Jean Mabillon was deeply influenced by the rigorous textual scholarship of his mentor, Luc d'Achery. Mabillon's groundbreaking work, De Re Diplomatica, so essentially diplomatics, as we were talking about before in 1681, meticulously established methods for authenticating medieval documents through paleographical and diplomatic analysis, marking the emergence, in fact, of paleography and diplomatics as scientifically rigorous disciplines. Right? I never studied diplomatics personally, because paleography and codicology were enough for me, were tough. I was even apparently versed, at least in properly script deciphering, but I couldn't at least remember very much all the names attributed by the paleographers to the form of this or that letter. Frankly, were incredibly boring. But these are beautiful disciplines. And diplomatics, however, is crucial because paleography basically analyzes the script, right? And all that can derive from there. Of course, they are mutually interdependent disciplines in many ways. Codicology studies the manuscript as an archaeological piece, fundamentally, whereas diplomatics is something sort of more institutional, more, say, informed by other disciplines that detach a bit themselves from this, and that had, however, to do with, in fact, the recognition of proper authentic documents. There are lots of people out there, including, I don't know if you remember the Reddit discussions, is Schwerpunkt an authentic source? Imagine trying to, question whether something is historically accurate, if anything, or not, and not even knowing what authentic means in the historical dictionary, nevertheless, or even just in your own language, for that matter. In any case, this discipline is incredibly important, as you can appreciate mostly the development of politics, of institutions, of law, and more, as essentially this certain documents are truly tied to the power that issued them, and through that you can understand a whole lot. Through, for example, look at seals, right, and their iconographic representations. What do they tell us about the symbology? Properly, the iconography, the traditional meaning behind it all. It's an incredibly relevant aspect, and it's just one of the otherwise pretty complex and complicated discipline themes on how to really assess, for example, the even just by scheme, by layout, what an authentic document is as opposed to a forgery that existed. And maybe there are historical forgeries, meaning that they date back to still very old times, but were created for legitimizing at some point the position of someone, even though they had not, for example, received that particular privilege, whatever. This gives much more sound methodological foundation to the Medievistics, because at that point it's not just reading stories and or reinterpreting the same under merely literary philological point of view, but you add a lot of also concrete material kind of interest towards this or that manuscript. Naturally, historians, as we've seen before, were already very well versed actually in this thing. It would be extremely interesting to, to listen to what Mabillon would have had to say to us at the time, which we know in part through his work, but with an interview. And going back in time once again, and having Mabillon talking with Petrarch, they spoke also French, they would have understood themselves, and they're just, as you understand here, 300 years of distance from one another, so it's not a particularly long time before, and not even to ourselves, technically. And asking, for example, Petrarch what kind of attention and eye and sort of experience he had, for example, in recognizing a manuscript from another, document from another. And there we would have laid out, of course, the heart and soul of entire eras of historians and researchers. The aforementioned period, the 17th century and tendency towards the 18th, a more disciplined methodology in analyzing documents as a whole, confirming their authenticity and cross-referencing them alongside a substantial increase in the volume of documents accessible to researchers, driven by the same Maurist systematic organization of monastic archives, but not only, because states themselves were starting to essentially organize their own documentation, their archives in more complex fashion. Normally, libraries themselves had always represented a bit of a treasure for this thing, and if you entered some medieval monastery, unsurprisingly, you could find all these different type of sources put there together. I mean, how much do we know, for example, about high medieval law, if not through monastic libraries per se? We know that, and there is the historical bias in it, because normally monks, for example, tend to preserve only the documents that were essentially victorious disputes over other actors, right? We know that the peasants were very legally active, but of course they didn't really have archives or places where to maintain their own, because also law initially was much more of a public thing, and there were already at the time some kind of archives in public institutions. But at large, right, some of these were perishable, were wars, again, destructions, etc. Some things never changed. Monasteries in many ways remained much more sheltered, but also hosted types of sources were somehow characteristic of their deal. Without mentioning that, given the broader crisis of monastic foundations in the later Middle Ages, notoriously for anyone who has studied codicology, an enormous amount of older manuscripts from, the 12th century, say, for example, were reused as, book covers for now paper books by the same monks, for example. And you understand at that point the enormity of, this is typical also for especially manuscripts of cheaper relevance, right? You find always, as a cover of a same, some 15th century manuscript and antiphonary of the 13th century wrapped around this paper code. Like, so very relatable things, and on those you could also rewrite on. Besides, parchment back in the day made a much more robust cover, and as you know, paper was easier to produce, but also tended to degrade itself more than the same parchment, way more. So you have all this my codicological and paleographic. I worked with manuscripts. I worked with the actual material in hand. In any case, the aforementioned expansion facilitated a deeper understanding of medieval, institutional transformation, prompting a shift away from the habitual analytic style of historical writing, which focused on a chronological sequence of events. Naturally, that had historically been quite complex by itself, but as we just explained, it wasn't just about a departure from the analytic style. It was probably the establishment of a new type of studies that were acting in parallel with more traditional historiography. Although Mabillon's Annales Ordinis Sancti Benedicti, so the annals of the Order of Saint Benedict, adhered to this conventional, in fact, historiographical model itself, reflecting his dedication to chronicling, of course, his own Benedictine history as a defense of monastic traditions. Importantly enough, in a world that was ever, already at the time, scarier in a modern direction, political concentration, but also, again, the affirmation of also Protestant enemies, neighbors of France. The era's ecclesiastical scholarship enriched the field of so-called antiquarianism. Since antiquity, antiquarianism, running parallel to annalistic history, involved studying artifacts and data to reconstruct past lifestyle and institutions. You understand that especially the church had a lot of paraphernalia that were, per se, the ecclesiastical treasures. Also think about the same relics. I made a video about, besides relics in medieval France, mostly in the video about pilgrimage, about in medieval France. So there is much tied also to this, because as we've seen, not just temporally we're very close, but this is still an ancien regime. It's an incredibly continuative culture, society, with a medieval one in many ways. And France especially had this characteristic before the revolution. So antiquarianism, in and of itself, especially looking at the great treasures, not just of classical antiquity, but of the same Renaissance that at this point was becoming kind of history, and that, as you know, had been surpassed by other types of sort of, of art that naturally were in their ways quite traditional, but had quite lost some of the genial foundation of the great, in fact, artists of the Renaissance era, evolved from a static, detailed cataloging of peculiar customs to a more cohesive and dynamic portrayal of the past, more sensitive to historical change. Through antiquarianism, people began to understand that the past had passed also through material culture, one that was absolutely loaded in spiritual meaning, but that, however, could offer quite a relevant picture of that gone era. There is also an today, we will not talk about archaeology because we talk about historiography, but a certain taste also for, I don't know, there is a level of paleontology at this point develops where it had always been a thing. I mean, Augustus himself had the room of the monsters with dinosaur fossils and things like that. And there is all a traditional explanation to the existence of these creatures that is very fascinating to see. Naturally, the 17th, especially the second half of the 17th century, and even more the 18th, of course, is already a phase of accelerated modernization. So, in a sense, the contrast between the past and the present becomes increasingly sharper, creating a bit that, oh wow, this is how they actually lived vibe, which up to that point in a pre-industrial society had really never had too much sense in a broader perspective, because at large people believed that more or less the past had been similar to their own. In fact, you understand that especially in Renaissance art, that there is a great deal of flattening of those differences or adaptations. So they're saying that today we can paradoxically better understand as we have developed historiography further, and that we can thus critically derive a lot of information from about the same Renaissance in that case, rather than antiquity through it per se. All right. So when you enter museums and you find dioramas, mankins, and so on, well, just say the 17th century had something to do with that. And it wasn't, again, anything new. This had always existed. If you think about, I don't know, the statues of the saints historically, and how important this had been. We've seen a lot of iconoclasm in the Protestant countries. Those were, and we know it, for example, from the series of Arms and Armor, incredibly important. Think about the military saints, iconographic evidence for, and probably also tridimensional one in the case of statues proper, of probably the description of Arms and Armor back in the day. Think about the armor of Saint Maurice at the Dome of Magdeburg. That is one of the earliest references of Western plate armor. It's an incredibly beautiful statue. And imagine how, in that sense, materially important it is. Now, during the same period, the oratorian Louis de Thomassin, we've seen the oratorians as far as Baronius in Italy was also concerned. So remember that these ecclesiastical congregations, orders, so on, are very much transnational. Obviously enough in Catholic Europe, that was quite well placed, as we've seen in terms of historiographical development at the time, and leading the way, essentially. Now, Thomassin was a priest from Aix-en-Provence, where, as you know, this is close to Arles, Marseille, in the southeast of France. Thomassin, whose theological training at the Oratory of Paris shaped his focus on ecclesiastical history, systematically outlining the development of ecclesiastical institutions through successive stages in his work Vetus et Nova Ecclesiae Disciplina. So literally studying the old and new ecclesiastical discipline. Drawing on which sources? Well, patristic texts, obviously canon law, to trace their evolution, however, from early Christianity. I made some videos about this topic, how ecclesiology started clothing itself with an increasingly historiographical scientificity and critical and analytical depth. We've seen that this has started from the Renaissance. We cited how Valla, a papal humanist, was the same guy who debunked the false donation of Constantine, and that was still done in a fully theologically coherent Catholic take on the past. In fact, in the same ecclesiastical sources, we're finding here ourselves, first of all, in very high level of cultural development throughout all these eras. We're also starting to see how, and I had the privilege to know someone who's expert in this kind of more like, studying sources of, 7th century Gallic councils, right? It's something insane because of the sheer beauty of, in fact, the codicological and paleographical form of these works. I mean, people will literally sit down in archives looking at works that have been basically stratified through insertion, removals, etc. of these manuscripts that are, again, look like a Frankenstein version of a medieval book, and that are pertaining to this or that ecclesiastical institution that had historically traced, for example, the issues of all the various councils. And as you know, it's an incredibly complicated history if it weren't just for this codicological and paleographical aspect alone, deciphering what is written there in which context. But it's something extremely complicated. I can't digress. If anything, I can make a video if you want about paleography, codicology, because they're incredibly fascinating disciplines, as you just explained. But if anything, also the deep political and cultural and religious work that lays behind them. That is to say, why did this church, throughout its history, decided, for example, to salvage only specific conciliar provisions, right? Consider that in the old councils, including the ecumenic ones, it's not like when something was established like a dogma, a doctrine in particular, there was a standardized text, right, in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages. You had all the delegations of the various bishops attending that wrote, the same bishops, they had their own scribes, who wrote down something that was naturally not stenographed in with audio AI analysis, AI audio recording, but literally written down also for the sake of the interest of those specific metropolitic sees, dioceses, and even smaller churches. Consider also what was written down to be provided to the local churches when these delegations came back home, and how, for example, ecumenic councils naturally were not attended always by the same people. Also, there were the regional councils and provincial councils, and so every single church would basically treasure in different ways this incredibly stratified and unique kind of sources that needed an incredibly sophisticated training in order to browse, to analyze, to understand. Right? And this is what starts happening at this time. In ecclesiastical history, you can't really do without it, right? There isn't such a thing like you hear mostly. I don't know if you come from the United States, the entire point of religion is finding guilt of different organized groups without even having open a manual on basic ecclesiastical history. That doesn't make any sense. You must have a culture, you must have an education, you must have something that goes really high and beyond any kind of even motivation of that kind to really objectivize the accurate reconstruction of the reality of the era, which is something completely different, if anything, from a mental point of view. And that requires, in fact, a whole set of other knowledge that you can't quite immediately find as if it were nothing. It's obvious, by the way, that through such fascinating discipline, you can have a much more complete and nuanced understanding of the history of the church, in all its also political meaning, right? So not merely, standalone institution, but its deep intertwinement with also the lay world dictating its policy, its measures, its issues. The Maurist approach and the transformation of antiquarianism into true historiography formed the foundation for Ludovico Antonio Muratori's dissertations on various facets of medieval society and life, published between 1738 and 1743 as the Antiquitates Italicae Medievi, right, so the Italic antiquities of the Middle Ages. Muratori is one of the single most important historiographers who ever lived, and the first founder of a truly trustworthy, reliable text of medieval sources, medieval historiographical tradition that scholars still rely on, right? Muratori was a Modenese priest and librarian to the Este family in Modena. Herself, he was influenced by his mentor, the scholar priest Carolus Sigonius, that we talked about in our last episode, which is really interesting in just generational perspective as well. Muratori surpassed Sigonius' analytic works on Italian history as he emphasized primary sources and archival evidence in his Annals of Italy. Muratori also drew on the exemplary 17th century erudite editions for his extensive collection of chronicles. The most important, in fact, edition we're talking about really in still in some cases in use, because some of these chronicles eventually were re-edited also outside of Muratori's tradition. But you have, as medievalists all heard, essentially the Rerum Italicarum Scriptores. It's just like the Monumenta Germani Historica. We're talking about really the cornerstone of Medievistics. It's incredibly fascinating in this sense that we're talking the Holy Roman Empire, we're talking the Italic Kingdom, the German Kingdom, and therefore a world that was a bit in between tradition and innovation, and that produced such extraordinary works of historiographical compilation. Naturally, the French, the English also did stuff like this, but these came earlier and with standards that were really unsurpassed, also considering the times being, in the sense, the places that even enhanced this feat per se. The Rerum Italicarum Scriptores are a monumental project initiated by Muratori under the patronage of the Duke Francesco III of Este to preserve Italy's medieval textual heritage. Again, we are in the late 17th century. This drags on, again, the first editions up to the 18th century. but because there were different waves. Then after, in the late 19th century, early 20th, there was another one, and then I think now they arrived to the third or the fourth editions of different sources, because eventually also some sources that had not been covered by Muratori and his helpers and friends, because this was a pretty wide net of scholars working under the direction of Muratori all across Italy, were by reverence and veneration towards this figure attached to the Rerum Italicarum Scriptores. In fact, it's still published. And the extraordinary aspect, as I was just premising, is the fact that this work was carried out by raking, the entire Italian medieval manuscript production existing at the time. Remember, what I love about this story is how close to both us in the Middle Ages, so straight in between, these men were, right? It's truly a bridge between the past and the future as we understand it in historical hindsight. This is beyond belief. In many ways, of course, the criteria... The criteria of philology are very, very high, right? You can't look at this source and say, well, basically they're badly done. But naturally, other manuscripts were found at some point that could correct part of the philosophical differences. There were some, and this affected, of course, and also original works, by the way, because these, the great importance of these works is that they were commented on, right? They were presented. The editor described what this chronicle was about. There were notes that explained the various contexts. There was an incredible work also of just, given that medieval chronicles, as we've seen, mostly followed a chronological order, and were not, however, necessarily written or composed, because some had been collected. For example, there could be 12th century chronicles, and then continuations were written, and then at the end of the 14th century, an author put together like other chunks, excerpts, etc., or the manuscript tradition was damaged and would just have certain fragments of that work. So it's an incredibly difficult job. Philologists mostly do this together with codicologists, paleographists in this case, given the material, the scriptory medium. So at some point, also not everybody was Muratori. So if this was done across, like, all, say, central northern Italy, with, by the way, the communications of the time, of the late 17th century, you can imagine how somehow homemade to a degree this could be done. I don't want to belittle that, because it wasn't literally homemade, even though, again, we're looking, like in this case, at prelates, noblemen, that really had a life in part of also of contemplation between different duties, administrative, military ones, etc., that had, however, vast resources also to invest in such studies, and to which, in fact, we owe a lot. The Ancien Regime did this, to never forget that. And especially, this is an Ancien Regime context, and it shows you, as I was saying before, that evidently obscurantism was not a thing. Naturally, there were lots of talks and ideas at the time, but you understand that the milieu that produced such works were very open, very valid, historically and historiographically wise, right? So this enormous supervision of all these various manuscripts brought to this incredibly well standardized and reliable historiographical production that's, again, still today largely in use. Another astonishing, important aspect of this is that the traditional background is even more traditional than we think. You have the Dukes of Este, right, as feudatories of the Holy Roman Emperor, in an Italy that here participates to the great exploit of the Habsburgs. From Modena was also Raimondo Montecuccoli, the generalissimo of the Habsburgic army that saved Vienna at the Battle of St. Gotthard. The one of the greatest, not just commanders of the era, but also the milestone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. So we're talking specific rulers, specific men of arms, specific men of faith that are, for example, Montecuccoli really provided himself, like in his works, a lot of insight on the warfare of the past era. So there was a very high level of historical culture that prompts these imperials for the love of the past, for the love of history in their own country, to fund this monumental work, successfully founding, again, what we understand as modern historiographical standards. It's big, all right? It's huge. And again, how much have you ever heard this celebrated? Be honest, at large, most of you didn't even know this was a thing either. Looking at Muratori, by the way, his most profound contribution as a historian may have been the Antiquitates we mentioned before. Muratori here is acutely aware of the gradual development of societies. In this work, he used legal and economic records to trace institutional changes across medieval Italy. He discussed, also, I think he's the veritable founder of a military historiography in Italy that I think recently we discussed. I don't remember at which. Because I published also in that journal from Italy that asked me to write a column for them. We talked about this. Oh yes, also in all those videos about the Italian communal army. Well, Muratori, that in fact was writing about mostly also the communal era, not only, also the Longobards one, etc., is actually the first modern historiographer to write about medieval Italian warfare, and providing insight that is actually very interesting if you read it about for example, the costs of war. There is this interesting economical bias that is still being followed by noting, of course, the military expenses, how this, I made multiple videos on how, public debt influenced the military expenses, or rather vice versa, of course, in Italian communes at different points. And so there was already, by the way, a strong awareness that we noticed already in the Renaissance in particular, in a country like Italy, towards not just ancient, but also medieval history. People read those chronicles, and the reason why the Rerum Italicarum Scriptores, which naturally means like the writers of essentially Italian stuff, Italic stuff, stem exactly like in most of these enterprises, not out of the blue, of course, but out of the specific interest that these authors already had towards authors that, by the way, were already known. It's not like Muratori simply revived, he discovered new manuscripts only, right? There was a great work of philological criticism and analysis and rendition of very important works, like, for example, Mussatus, that was, together with Villani, by far also, with a Latin prose, one of the greatest historians of the Middle Ages. There was a deep sense of civic political foundation. We've seen in other videos about, for example, Jean Froissart, how, for example, his works were sort of handed down historically, were very important. He was the Villani of France/Flanders, depending on where part of his background he wanted to emphasize. And of course, there were many copies, many manuscripts. It wasn't too difficult, again, to keep that together. Also, Mussatus had always been known. Villani had always been known. But the care that the Italic kingdom had on the basis of their urban tradition to tell the history of the communes, that, by the way, still existed in all of this, and looking at the stories sometimes of the emergence of the very dynasties that were just there, like the Este in this case, in modern age history, really from the 13th to 14th century, were already there, to really look at this as their own thing, as something which naturally intensifies, especially in the 19th century, in the age of nationalism, across all of Europe, but that obviously, given the sort of the prominence of communal civilization in the Middle Ages and this sort of urban aristocracy proclivity to cultivate its own municipal identities, naturally was very much developed and here, and that's why again Muratori is remembered as the primate, let's say, the founder of such modern historiographical tradition for the Middle Ages, and not only for the Middle Ages, because we must stress this too, that while of course there were modern histories that were much more agile, considering as written in the moment in modern times, the reconstruction in the Middle Ages entailed, in a time like the 17th century, the early 18th, still looking at one of the major chunks of sort of the past, other than antiquity, that was also much more classically studied, of course, and therefore seemed like a bigger deal than it is today, first of all, so proving the fact that the Middle Ages were already understood at this point, not as the Dark Ages, as the terrible Gothic, barbarian, or whatever, but actually by, as we've seen, even by the same humanists, as a very interesting period worth of recognition. So they were born literally in the Middle Ages, but in this middle ground between the, as we will see also, I think, in other videos, about the demonization of the further demonization of the Middle Ages, already ingrained, especially in the Protestant world, against, in particular, in fact, again, the papacy and Catholic countries that they had remained at this point, but also the post-traditional Enlightenment, and sometime, at least in the most extremistic cases, even anti-religious aftertaste of the Enlightenment that actually was much more contemptuous towards the recent past. If we complain about the humanists for creating the Gothic myth of the Dark Ages, it's nothing in comparison to what the Enlightenment really did towards all previous history, practically, and the consequences of which we're still paying, right? So works like this prove how 17th, 18th century traditional people in general, not just Muratori as a priest, but also, as we've seen, the lay commitments, also the high feudal hierarchy of the empire, were absolute, and as also culture educated people, were very much interested in specifically medieval history. Here we're not talking about the 19th century. Muratori begins literally in the 17th century, informed by essentially who had been born in a counter-reformistic spirit like Baronius. So a moment where there isn't that stronger, for example, nationalistic, romantic suggestion of the myth of the nation, of the foundation of the same, of the recovery of tradition, against, as a backlash also against the same Enlightenment and revolutions that, in a sense, confer to the same nationalism a degree of anti-tradition, or at least had made nationalists forget what the traditional meaning of the nation was, right? It was essentially just, instead, disgregating, selecting out nations outside basically anything else, which is also what brought, to this day, most people just to focus on the history of their own country, and therefore knowing nothing nor about the rest, nor about their own country, because what's the value of a country if it is not in comparison with the other ones, just even in terms of power ratio. So it's really a deep problem. You really realize how the Ancien regime still got the right moral and scientific standards that at some point we simply decided to trash away and to clothe as a form of higher, in this case, historiographical understanding or mean. Again, there are some things that are improved, especially the technical level, the formal level, the mythological level, at least in part, for how humans turned out to be much less performing in individual qualitative terms. But this is exactly the point. You would never have the stamina, the culture, the intelligence of a man like Muratori, right? This guy literally knew the sources. I know it's difficult to explain this to people maybe maybe they are younger, they haven't received this enormous education, but to assess how your historical muscle sort of grows over just an incredibly long amount of time, an intense amount of work that even today is nothing compared to even a fraction of what these people did routinely and with the means of the times, literal manuscripts, nothing else, but still with this enormous dedication and therefore capacity of having impressed in mind an understanding of these sources that today we wouldn't even begin to comprehend. I mean, how many PhDs in medieval history today, even in Europe, actually know Latin and to read a chronicle in Latin, right? And this is actually a huge, huge issue, right? For example, AI is absolutely incapable of doing anything relevant at this point in terms of academic standards, and it's doubtful that it's ever going to be there, if anything, considering that we haven't even found a mean to precisely OCR scan the same, I don't know, Muratori's works. You can't imagine, even though they're all there public and you can read them, you can't imagine, even being proper in a citation or something like that. So it's something extremely relevant and at the time incredibly underrated as well. Though Muratori's dissertations were simply placed side by side, in a sense, their critical examination of sort of everything based on precise documentation reflected really a deep desire to grasp the complex and multifaceted dynamics of mankind history. This approach steered scholarship towards a civilizational history, akin to that developed by Enlightenment thinkers, but without the polemical rejection of the past's quote-unquote superstitions found, for example, in the incisive as despicable pages of Voltaire's Essai sur le mœurs et l'esprit des nations. I talked a bit about this in a recent video about the Battle of Pétavardin. The beginning was exactly dedicated to mostly at that point throughout the 18th century, obviously, as we have reached it. The loss of meaning, for example, as far as holy war was concerned. I mean, in this century had opened with of course, the wars against the Turk, and even in Mozart's Austria, the greatest composer in the history of mankind could make of the Turks some sort of funny, adulterated figure more than else. All right, and so when you look at Voltaire, that in his essay that is also further titled, the complete one is Depuis Charlemagne jusqu'à Louis XIII. So literally looking at, say, 800, 1600, right? The approach towards the nations is very much emptied. I mean, Voltaire was the classical sort of, again, iconoclast and hypocrite in many ways, self-sabotaging figure for both France and Catholicism. Also delusional, for example, in finding Frederick the Great, nothing but an actually very traditionally aristocratic ruler that he, of course, could not be in line with. So that is also a very good example of, the later 18th century French sort of decline in a broader moral sense before the Revolution, all the, let's say, the contradictions of a system that had been modernizing and expanding too fast without too many checks, and with, of course, in the world, an aristocracy, the French one really being the one incarnating the most, like the broader European spirit of at least the achievement of a tendentially imperial establishment collapsing under weight of the revolution. And even powers like Prussia, that although Protestant, was in this sense still getting it more qualitatively successfully. And again, at least during the 18th century, then Napoleon wipes out the Prussian army and Frederick's military tradition. And so there you understand that also in the revolution there is a brusque coming back to something more authoritarianly traditional, and again the theory and the foundation was still way more effective and capable in Napoleon, in the empire, etc. So we'll talk more about that. I have something, still haven't prepared it, but I want to discuss it about the creation of the Landwehr as the consequence also of this sort of needs of universal conscription, as they had been mutuated and even improved in the Prussian tradition after the French model. I have von Clausewitz author for a reason. We talk about Scharnhorst, etc. Because they are also a new world, one that would sort of go against that brutalized brutalizing modernism and secularism sort of found, until especially World War I, some sort of strong wall of resistance, at least from particular countries that eventually lost anyway. So that is also quite meaningful regarding the general collapse of the entire system, the broader degeneration of mankind towards the abyss. But it's interesting in this sense to follow the various historiographical dynamics exactly on the basis of such, at some point, misunderstandings. I mean, Voltaire is, I presume, in some conventional sense, thought of a great author in positive terms. Obviously, he is a great author, and I was myself very much into his work. I loved Candide, for example. I found it very interesting. There is a lot about Voltaire that is definitely relevant and precious. But at the same time, looking at, for example, these other, again, priests as sort of relics of some abject and backward superstition, we realized that they were capable already of studying the Middle Ages in ways that were actually very objective and very... You don't find ecclesiastical rhetoric in Muratori's work, also because he wasn't really even being the only one that was working at this thing, but also because literally he didn't care about that, right? The important thing was restoring a precise vision of the past in the most objective possible way, something that, for example, Voltaire was definitely not capable of doing, and constantly blaming this terrible superstition and, I don't know, blaming the same... His hypocrisy went as far as also as Catholicism was concerned, while, I don't know, in this story is telling, I don't know, about the brutal massacres carried out by the Catholics at some point during, I don't know, the English Civil War, but not talking about, I don't know, the most famous ones by Cromwell in Drogheda, etc., were actually much bigger than anything that the Catholics did there. And I myself actually like, from a Catholic standpoint, Cromwell's figure, because, again, I like objectivity, and I would not make the point that Cromwell was doing something particularly terrible, considering the means to an end that those actions really entailed for the strengthening also of an English power, a reassertion of control over the Irish and more. But you see, who wrote history at that point? Like Voltaire was simply using a double standard, and at the end of the day, whoever knows his work quite famously knows about this hypocrisy, this sort of leitmotif also in Voltaire's, the historiography on Voltaire. But people may still see him as a hero of the beautiful Enlightenment that, again, as I sadly discover, the more I go on, especially in the conservatism across the Atlantic, is still seen as literally, even by very, very sort of namely strong conservatives, as the moment in which everything clicked and, we despoiled ourselves of superstition and everything started going well because industry and capitalism is a word coined by communists, by the way, in a contemptive terms, and you're using essentially Marxist language for that. So congratulations for not understanding what is also instead hysterically and puritanically rejected, the notion that earthly power is actually divine power, which is the actually traditional way to go, but it has not to do in this sense with a merely economicistic, capitalistic concept that is motivated by, in fact, historical materialism of a communist mold, right? So if you do not know these things, you may, in acknowledging them, you may understand how far from the traditional axis the entire dialectical world, let's say, has gone in terms of sort of conventional communication nowadays. Look at YouTube, what has become. Podcasts of people like there are pseudo-conservatives in terms of, now I will say the shocking thing, but they don't even know the stuff, right? They don't even have a historical culture, just people who want to basically fit that weird tagging that spread, especially again in certain parts of the West. I am this, I identify as that. It's the same identical thing the left does, by the way, and lacking an actual structure, backbone, virility, authority, culture, power. It's incredibly difficult to understand these things if you are literally being born and bred outside of them. In any case, since we talk about the 18th century, the expansive scope of the erudite tradition, the philosophical inspiration of Enlightenment historiography inspired Romantic era historians to undertake a comprehensive reimagining of the Middle Ages, viewing the historical process as spontaneous, inherently organic, and positively directed development. And again, today is not really the best day to talk nor about Romanticism, nor about how this intertwined with nationalism and positivism. But there is much of course, this crave for coming back to traditional models that is anti-traditional, at least post-traditional, in and by itself, and at some point distancing ever further from that direction, right? The fact that especially the French Revolution informed a more radically democratic sort of, at least concept, that was never attained, nor by the revolution, nor by, at any point, right? The terror in and of itself, for example, was not even that bloody as people think it was, but the mere fact that there was now a flattening towards an abstract context of equality that may have been, by the way, in part driven by what was a different power distribution, for example, in the classical era. If you look again at the Romans, at the Hellenes, but the same Celts or the Germans, of course, there was less of an elite that existed in the Middle Ages or of the modern age, or even in the same contemporary one, even after the Revolution. And so the principle of being a more cohesive body, for example, resuming some historically fascist, for example, concepts of Catholic unity. I also made an entire video paralleling the Lectorian Acts to actually the Christian cross, and it's theologically an incredibly coherent point to make, as you can understand in that video. Was definitely not understood by the human temper of the times. It was not understood because, of course, humanity did not actually step further. Essentially, step further in a mass sense, because mass society is born through industrialization and more. And definitely, there is a broader achievement to this. There is more power wielded, as we've seen just with the Napoleonic era. You can appreciate to which extent that reached and how the West remained, for example, the center of this power. But at the same time, you realize that when the mass augments, it's not like the quality of people augments. And quality, relative equality, can be measured naturally in ways that are the ones that must be expandable. You can't feel yourself high quality today because you're habituated to give a price, for example, to your education, to your upbringing, to your professional experience, but the price is never about an absolute value. It can enshrine some of it, But price in and of itself is just like a materialistic measure. The way you tie yourself into the rest of the world, and so the relative worth that you have is the one that can have a redeeming and transcending power and capacity. And indeed, the 19th century was quite very overtly about this. Like when you realize that, for obvious reasons, after World War II, great part of the idealism of traditionalism, etc., that stemmed from the 19th century, the ideologies also that, to some degree, also hijacked them, far from, again, the more traditional cores of the same ideologies, came to, in part, positively apply to them because they almost took over the world, but also bring into a conflagration and especially an ultimate defeat, which was basically the raison d'etre, the self-legitimizing standard of Nazi fascism, victory, right? That was eventually not achieved. What we have forgotten is not just the values of antiquity or the Middle Ages, but it's the fact that very close to us, so just generations could be the ones of our great-grandfathers, traditional wisdom had been largely recovered, at least in an intellectual sense, also in a historical and historiographical sense, before being basically banned once again, together also with, for example, military historical studies that became the appanage not just of the Anglo-American winners, which would have been a positive thing per se, but in that sense declined to that sort of positivistic, empiricistic, and unfortunately also culturalistic and sometimes even socialistic dimension was normalized, especially after the 1960s, 1970s, creating enormous disasters, not just, again, because of the relative historical subject matter, but because of the pollution that they caused within the same historiography. So what kept the glue that keeps together our historical understanding, and that was, in a sense, ever more demonized, right? That's the thing I was pointing out last week in that video commentary on Kings and Generals, what everybody gets wrong about feudalism. So this notion that you need the 1990s, social historian that realizes that, oh, look, this term had also other terms that could mean the same thing. So we have to redefine and rethink the entirety of what, great scholars of the 19th or 20th century perfectly knew much better than anyone about as far as the nature of feudalism as it actually existed historically wise. Same what with this, that essentially the traditional worth that 19th century historiography was loaded with was often misunderstood. There is no doubt that in part it was hijacked by mass phenomena, and that it was indeed sucked into some statalistic, nationalistic narrative that was very often very superficial, if anything, because it was a part of mass society. So spreading knowledge from the schooling system that was incredibly cheapened and superficial. It had nothing to do with one of the great aristocrats of the past that had really probably a superior understanding of reality, and that, however, became, just out of mass society for demographic reasons, the basic foundational point of reference, in fact, of any other historical cultural reference. It's essentially the ones that we're still paying for today in terms of basic myths, like literally the average middle-aged person that does not know that, in fact, the Middle Ages were not Dark Ages, or that there were actually not this bad time to live compared nor to ancient or modern history. Now that there is something inherently wrong or negative about medieval history, or let's say the medieval past, that also stemmed in great part, depending on which country especially, but also mostly uniformly because of the broader, ever more internationalized bias towards this stuff, towards that kind of period and era. And let's enter this 19th century, because here the timeline, of course, would really require further insight of sort of more clearly enucleated periods and times. Like, naturally, we can't exhaust the 17th or the 18th century historiographically just with this. But this is a broader survey on the history of medievistics. And I think it's necessary to really look at the 19th century in some important depth, as well as the 20th, because of all the dynamics that we just discussed, including the one that I would point out is to be found even among, structuralists, even people of Marxist background in the 20th century, that, however, studying the Middle Ages and understanding it, if anything, because even if they hated them, had learned that from their idealistic professors of the previous generations, actually had a very deep understanding of medieval history, also in a traditional, at least in a social-cultural sense, that they flattened to some extent, or bringing the attention objectively were towards social history or material, say, economic history that had not previously been that considered, as there was a bias towards the lower estates/cases that had been more involved in those kind of lower aspects by definition. In this sense, should not be put aside. I was, for example, in my academic background, I had, for my entire curriculum at university, from the bachelor to the PhD, one single tutor who was essentially a liberal person with even maybe more leftistic tendencies than I thought. But when we talk about history, we didn't have any divide in that sense. I didn't spot any specific. There were, of course, differences depending on what, but they weren't influenced by any specific political, any heavy political distortion that I could notice, because there is a field that is the one of science and morality that history cultivates in ways that you cannot elude, because this is not like philosophy. In history, you explain reality for what it is, not for what you think it may be. Everything comes from history in a way, and when, obviously, it depends, because also historians may be specialized just in a particular period, so not knowing in another, tending to be very good at that, but looking at today's society and not understanding what is going on. This is absolutely normal. This is, unfortunately, again, yet another consequence of hyper-specialization, but it still brings to some greater objectivity, because in history, things also that you explain must make sense, right? You can't assume that something will explain itself by itself merely because you wish it to go in a way or another. And history really presents you quite hardly with this kind of perspective. Now, at a broader point that I wanted to make, but never underestimate the actual quality of history, regardless of who expounds that. Yes, I've also in Schwerpunkt, I made videos criticizing some asinine takes by people who literally have a chair at university and that, completely informed, right manuals with some communistic bias getting everything right. It's extremely rare, though. In fact, I was surprised myself to read certain things. And I can't say that whoever makes this kind of mistakes in general, for whichever reason, at least from the academic milieu where I came from, the general, say that there is a general contempt towards mistakes that are actually done. Skepticism is also another thing you shouldn't exceed in too much. In fact, it ties a bit all into this. Historians sometimes, by not having same historical references, unsurprisingly make some general mistakes. As we said before, the Enlightenment not just constituted a model to react from and to, in fact, to spread a romantic counterpoint to. it also informed the same 19th century historiography. For example, the aforementioned Romanticism drew actually a lot in terms of the general natural vision of the world towards from the Enlightenment, as far as, for example, the development of nations, of cultures were concerned. This may seem a very common concept to say, in fact, common law, the idea that there is a natural law that is essentially the divine one, that peoples just come by nature to be who they are, endowed with rights that fundamentally reflect their broader universal standing. This is a very traditional concept, as a matter of fact. In fact, there is a good part of Enlightenment that is accurately scientific in the description, also historical phenomena. But it is not quite that left to Romanticism, nationalism, this bias of say of positive development of the individual nation without much, as a natural process that is not much tied to a broader divine order. Remember the aforementioned Voltairean contempt towards the same church, the same divine law, for how it had also been maintained by the great medieval imperial tradition in its most golden Apollonian heavenly forms. The 19th century is tendentially trying to recover certain traditional ideas, but for purposes that are unavoidably serving the individual nations. Positivism, later evolutionism, will also instill this incredibly pernicious concept, erasing the idea of constant spiraling down and degeneration of humanity, as if every country were basically to always grow to some higher levels, and not realizing that these people throughout the centuries, the millennia, actually degenerated at every level in actual quality. When you have to celebrate a nation for the sake of itself, and so making the average person believe that just because they're born into a place they are immediately valid, regardless of whatever they do, well, it's not really a great traditional recipe. And this is what most people do not fundamentally understand: the traditional meaning of the nation. If you lose, it's because you have sinned. All right, glorious, divine chosen nations win. Right, they do not simply fall heroically. There may be some good to that. There is a math or there that matters. Math also does count in some ways, but that's always the point. Right? Why, from the other side, if the divine potential is infinite, this nation did not attain superiority? So this is a concept where really people have a lot of difficulties, especially today, and start, in fact, from mass society. This concept was completely alien before that, and also reflected by the obvious achievements of peoples, which is pretty much the same today. Like, more powerful powers are truly powerful not by size but by quality, right? And as such, they tend to be much more stable, and also they tend to confederate in some greater order, which is indeed incarnated by Western civilization. There is a reason. We explain it in every video at this point. Now, especially in yesterday's one, right, about Charlemagne and Clovis's legacy as far as the restoration of the Roman Empire is specifically commended by God. In our European legacy from them in this path. Now, the relentless curiosity of erudite scholars and their commitment to well-substantiated evidence resulted in this passage from the Enlightenment to Romanticism that, as you know, also overlap at different times. in work that was both scientifically robust and intricate, meticulously detailed, yet broad in interpreting individual experiences as part of a complex, evolving civilization. This is a very interesting and obvious aspect of the stepping up of, in fact, this aforementioned civilization by scale that can reach, by sheer power, greater horizons, but is sort of more confused in the within, and so obviously can reach wrong conclusions. But it's interesting because it is a form of it's an object of debate, let's say, that has remained till to this point. Essentially, when you watch any of my videos or you search for any other history one on YouTube, you're actually wanting this. You want something that basically condensates some particularly nuanced, in-depth kind of explanation of a given topic, but also being able to frame it into a broader spectrum where you can connect all the parts within it. Personally, I've always been inspired to that because it's a bit like the environment where I live, mentally, professionally, culturally. I'm all about this now, so I like to train myself for this. And I know that to many, my videos are unbearable, but those who stick around, it's because evidently they recognize and understanding is more needy, but exigent in a truly sophisticated and rightfully demanding way, right? So this is the paradox also of mass society. You have bigger nations, bigger states, bigger historiographical productions, because at this point there are more universities, there are more professors, people are more literate. So there is this enormous task now of reordering this system once you stepped up at an unprecedented level of absolute power wielding. This naturally highlights the differences between nations as well, right? And when you recover the traditional meaning of the nation, these differences are not random, as we've seen. So it seems as if, especially for those who take the nationalistic aspect of this, is especially exalted further by positivism, by, again, some cheap, lower forms of emotional, animal-like exaltation of this worthless individual, but masses put together, like populism. There is all a, let's say, a competitive mindset which is not aiming much anymore at say, reuniting the system, but apparently to simply take over the others, right? And it's something which doesn't even start to take into consideration the opportunity of seeing what exists in common in order to unite this power further, right? It's as if Protestantism, the outcome of the 30 Years' War, so what people call the post-Westphalian ideal, so this notion that there is basically just one state that is a unitary system where people speak only that language, they have only that ethnicity, they have only that religion, and so we still live in this world where you can recognize, again, any army just as a regular force of that specific flag, which also was never a thing. It's not a thing even today, telling the truth. But that still very much reflects this level of lowness in understanding of the world, because isn't there something higher than this? Like, you can, of course, see how a nation will tendentially compete with the others in order to elevate itself and lording at some point over the same. But if you especially focus on how these ideas evolved, especially in the 20th century, in the sublimation of some specific socialistic and or nationalistic ideologies, that this seemed to entail an actual purpose of destruction, not of recomposition, more than else, or at least of further development that had basically to fill the void left by destruction. And this is pretty obvious. You may think of National Socialism, the Lebensraum at Similia as the sort of more straightforward example, but it's not like the Soviet Union was envisaging anything but the destruction of humanity through its Marxistic understanding of the system, even though they didn't even realize that it was just an excuse for more power grabbing. But the same disorder that derived from that brought, in fact, to communism to fail and to be incredibly dysfunctional, and at least fortunately causing death mostly inside itself than outside. But that's also not quite a consolation, frankly, because it also caused an incredible amount of pain and suffering to the rest of the world that, however, evidently was also to some point not able to stop this. It was sinful, as we explained, traditionally wise. The Enlightenment belief in modern progress, understood as a gradual emancipation of consciences and laws from the medieval era's barbaric, ecclesiastical, and feudal distortions, gave way to the conviction that the modern world's origins lay in the nations, in particular, emerging from the creative medieval movement. This aspect is also, again, always a matter of spectrum, right? It's not like in the 19th century people just simply believed, never make this mistake, that now all scholars belonging to Romanticism believed this about the nation, even when they were nationalists themselves, all right? There is a much deeper and broader meaning, even to that modern form of nationalism. But it is indeed clear that what had, as we've seen up to a very few generations before, mostly interested during the Ancien regime, like the attention of historiographical production, was in fact something that had only partially cared about the nation. As we've seen, I don't know, Muratori could look at Italy and say, okay, well, we're interested in this relative national. It was mostly also about, well, it was about the whole of Italy, but it was also, given the chronicling production, mostly central northern Italy, so the Italic kingdom. That naturally was properly a nation, you can argue, within you can argue the broader Italian culture that existed, absolutely, also in a tendentially national direction at this point, but also within the Holy Roman Empire. And so systems that were particularly, as we've seen also since the time of Flavius Blondus, for example, also framed within the traditional ecclesiastical centrality. For example, Germany was not just more sort of fragmented in a feudal direction, but it was also multi-confessional, right? So there were countries that had it easier to identify themselves in different ways. It's interesting how, for example, the German nationalism stressed the need for a recompositive nationalism, with a Sonderweg, where essentially the German federal tradition was indeed part of the German national spirit as quite a distinctive way to national unification, which is actually true, by the way. That's not wrong. But you understand how this, from one side, creates different national ideas, but how, in part, other broader suggestions are left aside. Just to make an example, from a German perspective, how do you reconcile, like for example, a broader, let's leave aside the barbarian word, which is maybe too broad, but let's say, for example, a Germanic direction. Why is Germany pursuing its Germanic, its German goals, in fact, and not Germanic in a broader sense? Because, of course, like, Germanic was attributed at some point to the Germans. It was also the official titling at some point of the Holy Roman Empire, in fact, of the Germanic nation, not of the German nation. But what about Sweden? What about Norway? What about, that with, of course, the Holy Roman Empire, things were complex because there were Germans also outside of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. But why that secession, so to say? When is that you can basically say, here a nation is born? Obviously, the Middle Ages are the moment in which this broader national identity is formed, but how do you justify that? I mean, other than the fact that you have come to be developed like that, first of all, what about antiquity? What happened exactly there, right? How do you connect, for example, with the Scandinavians in that broader orbit and picture? Like these are big questions because you don't simply solve them, all right? And there is something similar also attained, in fact, a more universal explanatory direction. Excuse me, drink a little. In the 20th century, for example, in the Nazi case, on the basis of some racial standards that sound very biological and that should have immediately transferred as sort of, not necessarily zoological materialism, but let's say one that was pretty categorical about, like, if you are in a way, you can't be in another, and how had that race originally formed, right? And what kind of transfigurational capacity is there, right? You understand that these movements were anti-traditional in the measure in which they denied, for example, that obvious aspect. Why the Holocaust, for example? Why couldn't, for example, the Jews be, say, redeemed and transfigured in a Nazi vision? What was the actual connection with tradition? Of course, you can argue that there are aspects of destruction that are meant as a form of revitalization in mythology and so on. Again, I don't want to go down that path now because we don't have time, absolutely. But it's obvious that a broader universal domain, where, for example, the Germans also held the imperial title, what kind of meaning had it? Had it a meaning of ruling over other nations, or had it a meaning of eventually annihilating our nation, getting rid of the most annoying ones from a German perspective, namely the French or the Poles, even though the Poles did not at least have a state at this point in history, unfortunately for them, and also because of the Germans, but not just one, and opening that path, in fact, considering the Tsarists or other, in fact, populations provided with a national identity. Think about Ukraine in the Habsburgic that developed most of its modern national concept, which was absolutely on top of a much older one within the Habsburgic Empire. I made a video about that. What about the Slavs? Right, the Slavs never had like an hegemonically universal empire of any sort. So, how to solve the problem of nationalism in the Slavic world? Of course, there are pan-Germanistic movements, but not, for example, pan-Germanicistic more than much. The pan-Germanistic movement is mostly encompassing the broader problem of Central Europe, of the Germans. So basically, what we still consider like nationally and sadly the Germans today, but the Austrians as well, and I don't know, the Swiss, at least the German ones, and more, right? All the Germans scattered during the Ostsiedlung. Again, what about that? There is also pan-Slavism, but we all know that mostly ended up being some sort of Tsarist wet dream without much of a kind of also touch with reality at some point, and it eventually failed also because, again, you can't remain your own Eastern European dimension. You can also become a big power, but eventually you always remain marginal to the system. There is some reason for that, right? And why, for example, different Western nations are more overall solid and bulky. That would have been the pathway and the core way of a united Europe, which is paradoxically something that the Americans came up with, if you know, for the first time. Penn was one of those proponents, just like the United States, which was already envisaged before the same American independence. So you see how much actually is at stake, really. Just think how different or relatively distant was the concept of the Middle Ages for an American or post-colonial country of some sort, right? It's not like they weren't important or they weren't there, but they would have a completely different meaning, especially in ages like the ones of nationalism, of imperialism, where the eventually like war was always a step away, like breaking out, and the more you went on on that sort of on the wave that hubris of positivism would be ever more self-evidently destructive and dangerous for the system. As I explained in my videos about World War I, it's not like Europeans did not really know, at least those who were in charge over the masses, that the consequences of that war would have been devastating. Also, in the possibility, of course, that something could go wrong. The myth that various governments and militaries went at war without realizing the risks of it all. They literally thought that the war would last a few weeks or months. It's not true, all right? So, for example, that narrative derives from later spoliation of those historical times, as they were historiographically browsed, as essentially, these guys didn't know what they were doing because they were stupid, because they were nationalistic, because they were imperial. They perfectly knew what they were doing. And they kept doing it, because that's how you fight wars. It's not like wars are fought just once you start them, and, considering also the world forces involved. And you said, you could have said simply, sorry, well, if you really had wanted, by the way, to stop it there, we failed at the beginning, now, okay, let's stop fighting it. No, there was something to gain out of it, and that's why they kept on fighting. It wasn't simply, okay, we screwed up for some reason, and we'll simply go on as much as it takes not to show how bad we were. There is always a purpose to that. We've seen it also in the videos about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. While we have naturally a pro-Ukraine stance, it's not like you can say Russia is simply stupid in fighting that war, in the sense that they have nothing to gain with that. Of course, you can argue the extent by which it was already ridiculous in the annals of military history to see what the Russians did in 2022, differently from what they did in 2014, which was actually a success, and how much it already cost for this to ever become at any rate a success of any sort. And that is fair, but in general, right, never underestimate thoughts, never underestimate beliefs. Leave aside now this war, but going back to the 19th century, all these identities were surely supported by an evidence, and I think this is the most important aspect, that actually derives from history. Like, the more you study, I personally started like this. I was brought up, I was fairly well educated in general, not excessively cultured, but particularly dedicating myself to I was good at school, at university, but let's say I mostly did what I had to do. And it's just as a byproduct of that I actually discovered this entire deal of tradition, and why studying history actually fuels the same objectivity regarding that, the acknowledgement of this reality. That is exactly what they did in the 19th century. If you say 19th century today, first thing that comes into your mind is nationalism. All right, and so equates wrong in absolute terms. And we know how, again, post-traditional, if anything, we're not in some cases having some specific elements of anti-tradition that can be. But by studying at the peak of Western sort of civilization, in a sense, and proper parabola, in a therefore very modern and secular fashion, and sort of on text that mostly would not be talking about these ideas, tradition, and so on. And so, coming from a background that was very neutral, or at least trying to be aseptic towards these ideas, not much as a backlash to this, but as a sort of filler to the obvious gap left by this present world presentation, actually, I would end up realizing that in your early 20s, you're an iconoclast, right? You think that, I don't know, feudalism, like, again, that video on Kings and Generals keeps persecuting us here. Feudalism did not exist. This is something that a person at 22 in college likes to hear, all right? Without knowing anything about history at large, mostly due to their background, not much to what they could actually study by themselves at that point, but considering the average 22-year-old college, they never really understood the actual what's college corresponding to in practice, especially in age and timeline. But let's say every idiot is able to like such a concept, all right? Not every idiot, for sure, an idiot to begin with, is capable of understanding that that idea of feudalism was actually a very strong thing in the Middle Ages, and that, for example, the 19th century historiography that was propagating, naturally, a relatively more simplistic view of those values in strictly historiographical sophistication was, because yet had much to be dug in and discovered, was not wrong in stating that feudalism existed, for example. Not just the 19th century one here, making an example, like in the 20th century, again, everybody knows that feudalism existed. It's a perfectly acceptable term. But say those values expressed by feudalism, chivalry, all what was attached to knighthood, this historical millenary tradition handed down from mostly Europe, from the Indo-European past, etc., of the hero, of the champion, of the winged glory, of the mounted hero, and all riding the chariot, being guided by providence and God, becoming God himself. This is something which is simply there, and that hyper-characteristically 19th century vision of nations and romanticism could be devious for some aspects of the same. I don't know, for example, I detest the pre-Raphaelites. I detest even some pictures that I inserted, maybe sort of aesthetically, of course, expandable in general as a filler for the pictures, but that are incorrect, are actually stressing some kind of excess, right? That was not, for example, I don't know, it was the picture of Honorius, I think, the emperor was basically it's like an African guy, and they weren't to stress what? That there is a racial inferiority in the decadent Roman Empire in an age in which Europeans began to antagonize between, say, a Nordic and a Southern archetype, which naturally wasn't even considered literally in those ways. But the exasperation of it is ridiculous. There is also an effemination. For example, the pre-Raphaelites fundamentally are very sort of aestheticistically stylized towards a form of feminism, feministic fantasy, visually wise. I mean, there is no doubt about this. There is, which was that guy, the first one I also used in the picture here. Let me check. Alphonse de Neuville. This is where the illustrations for Guizot, we will talk about him as well, but let's say those were representing, I don't know, the Franks as Gauls of the 4th century BC. Those kind of ridiculous depictions. But other things, otherwise, were fairly accurate, and especially when you start gaining some eye for these things, you realize, for example, some details that are maybe part of a clumsy reconstruction. You say, look at this detail, though. They knew this aspect pretty darn well, and you realize that they were copying it from specific iconographic sources. This is not really different from how people still today want, for example, to archetypally see a plausibly accurate, soldier reconstruction. Think about the Ospreys or similar series. They respond to a need that is inherently universal and traditional. You want to see the beauty of a model. You want to see even a certain genetic beauty, right? A eugenetic model that is reflected, which is exactly, if you look here, for example, I inserted a beautiful painting of Diana the Huntress by Orazio Gentileschi in the 17th century. So the same century of Muratori, at least in the end, that is still presenting actually in the first part of much of Renaissance classicism in this picture. There is a genetic principle here at hand. Where do you think, I don't know, Botticelli represented all those blonde, blue-eyed people in an Italian context? There is a very deeply traditional understanding of the archetypes between, in the past, and together with that same identitary need for not something desecrating, but something valorizing. This is what the 19th century actually produces, but it does so by lacking the ultimate element of tradition, the form. Everybody can appreciate a country or another for, say, an archetypal beauty, but that is substance until you give it an order through a formal hierarchy that entails the other peoples. In part, racism did that, but it also did it again in a categoristic sense, meaning there are these races, they're fixed, there's no something between, especially they can't change. And this doesn't even explain, by the way, what kind of good is there in this race, for example, if it still exists and if still is, for example, exploited by the same Europeans, which is absolutely fine in the sense that, again, exploiting is a neutral term, does not mean depression, all this stuff. And again, there is in tradition a very specific reason why somebody is above and one under. But I mean, it's because it's a living thing, it's a living process, without which you cannot achieve the plenitude of a universal value. So these are all concepts that are quite provocatively resumed in the 19th century, and that we must absolutely remember whenever reading pages of 19th century authors. Because whether you read Georg Weiss or the Grimm brothers or any others, we'll see now also other countries, thinkers and authors of different kind, etc., you can't separate them really from their own broader context, and from the fact that that context is not merely ideal detached or is acting on a presumption of a dependent truth that they decided to create. They were aligning themselves still to universal standards and trying to return to the old world. It's a bit like, you can argue, the same renaissance of visual arts at the end of the Middle Ages. Was the Renaissance more traditional in the Middle Ages? Not really. But visually wise, this is... and so in terms of appearance, of relative superficiality, even though, of course, we can't speak that of Renaissance art, especially from our 21st century standpoint, but something that is more proper of the art than the action, right? It's a bit like looking at classical antiquity, looking at the beautiful classical Hellenic statues and realizing that, yes, they're very beautiful to watch, but they're more sensualistic, they're more naturalistic, they're not expressed in the rigid astronomic perfection of geometric painting that to an ignorant may seem like just, what a child would make in preschool for, I don't know, the birthday of their parents. It's actually, which is not obviously also in that, but that in fact has lost not really lost the natural capacity to connect with that, but at least to be able to enact that form of perfection and render his life not about some attempted consumption of different alternatives, but a strive towards a single point. So going beyond appearance and turning into action. Also, surely driven by contemplation. They couldn't exist without one another, still quite there. Well, the 19th century, again, was a lot about this, was really stemming from a deep and deeper sense of say, denied identity to some degree, right? Something which had been essentially lost to some form of, in fact, exasperated modernism and secularism, that especially the revolution had brought further. A revolution that is not really originating from this or that country, as if that country was just capable of generating that. On the contrary, but in the very essence of mankind, just with characters unevenly distributed, but still by a degree common to all, right? And so being a collective responsibility as far as that was concerned. So as you understand, everything is easily digressing towards a philosophical dimension. It's not a surprise that here we're really witnessing to, and again, in the next video we'll talk more about the Germans, because those are the ones that around which, and for so many different reasons that we already partly highlighted, most of this historiographical debate of the Middle Ages emerged, was sort of violently put on the fore regarding this unsolved issues, including one of the hierarchy of various nations, by the way. That was also another dear theme to the competition of the same this period. And so at some point the facade interpretation of history that the mass society itself had produced, and was to be instrumentally employed to convince countries just to go at war with one another, just to favor that for purposes that in general were at least rational, and absolutely not, as in the myth of the butchers, the product of some sort of substantial incompetence. We'll have to talk much more about this time's historiography and the great wars of the year, including World War I, and how that affected our view of the Middle Ages, for example, which is not banal at all, because literally the Middle Ages stopped with World War I in some parts of Europe. There is really a lot to say. Some stuff I lose it, because I'm thinking, as you understand, out loud, and so many concepts we will especially resume in the next video. But of course, you will say about Schwerpunkt, we talked about the Renaissance, and then this sort of more philosophical, theological, let's say at least broader, traditional aspect. Yes, because if you don't prepare yourself to this, you sort of can't really get where this thing makes sense in the way it is historiographically developed, in the way it informed the same topics that we're going to discuss. So we'll definitely look, especially as the more we go on, the more names we'll look at. So this video may sound relatively disappointing, but given that Medievistics was not yet fully articulated as we know it, we must understand what existed beyond it at the time to eventually create this Medievistics as well. And obviously it's not like Medievistics drives the world, unfortunately. There were put limits to providence. But it's exactly the reason why the interpretation of these crucial steps of history has become an ever more historiographical question, because this all became history, and incredibly important and serious things happened along the way. And so, again, everything definitely is tied with the entire meaning of the war. By the way, this introduction, this series about the history of Medievistics is is not just it's just more like an introduction to the history of Medievistics, which is something naturally shorter, and I'm making in multiple episodes because in general that's where you want to get with the you can't absolutely address these topics and not making multiple videos on them. However, if you're interested, and I told you also in the previous episode, I made a series 1 year ago or more, couple of years ago, about princely Germany. It was a year ago. It's three videos. They're all titled the same: Princely Germany 1250-1500, that partially address this. If anything, especially for the next video of this Medievistic series, they are very important, because there we discuss also how the Germans saw themselves and how this affected, in a sense, all the rest of the world. Then there is also another series that I made a few months before. At the end of 2023, you can search. It also has the same title, and it goes by parts 1 to 3. And again, the title is The Romantic Middle Ages, the Germanic Model and the Origins of Europe, which is 6 hours of pure Schwerpunkt and analysis about these things. Right, I think 6 hours are great. Here, with the history of Medievistics, we'll get to 8 probably. The series of Princely Germany is slightly shorter, but it arrives close to 6 hours. It's not less than 5 hours. So if you're interested, you can find plenty of further introduction to this. Besides, and I haven't created some playlist about modern history to core as well, contemporary history to core, but if you search through the key tradition, well, I'm not sure, but I thought about search revolution, because there is also under tradition, but this video here writes Revolution and Napoleon, distinguishing modernity and tradition in the juridical Enlightenment. It's actually a history of law video, but it does talk a lot about the nation state and how it came about and why we discuss it the way we do. This other video is very important, regulating tradition and modernity, double phase of the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution. Right, that is also very important. In fact, I think I will use them in the top 6 comments down below, and at some point I will make a playlist about historiography, because I don't think we can really go very far without that at some point. Again, I'm really glad that we are having this conversation, really glad that we're making these videos. You never know which ones get more views. These are relatively novel topics, and again, while we discuss them on Schwerpunkt, of course, we need an important time to digest them, in a sense, because they're not easy. They take a lot of time, and again, I'm glad that we can finally address them with more time, and I'm glad about the work we're doing. We're preparing lots of interesting videos. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. If you're interested in my upcoming content, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.